All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Atheniano Show. I'm here today with a very special guest, William Hamilton, who you probably know from past episodes. William Hamilton is now a master's philosophy student at KU Leuven, and he will be presenting his paper very soon entitled Affirming the Now, Nietzsche, Zen, and the Critique of Salvation. So, William, thank you so much for being here once again. It's been a while, but it's great to have you back.
Yeah, it's great to be on. It has been a while, and it's good to see the channel is still thriving since when I last left it. Congratulations on that, and to all the viewers, I'm, glad to be back.
Listen, I I know your paper is on Nietzsche and Buddhism, but I know from you personally that Nietzsche is someone that you are super passionate about. You're obsessed with. You've been obsessed with for a decent amount of time. Um, and before we get into like the specifics of his ideas, one of the things that I think is really important to do uh, in all subject matters, but particularly philosophy and one that becomes very complex, is how do you explain it to somebody that hasn't read a lot of the things that you've read, hasn't studied it for the length that you know, isn't familiar with the same terms that those of us who have gone through a philosophy degree are. Um, so to make this episode more accessible to the everyday person, and that's not a derogatory term, that's just somebody who hasn't studied philosophy. Can you explain to me in the most broad terms possible who Nietzsche was, what was his main ideas, and why the hell are you so damn obsessed with him?
So Nietzsche is a very interesting character. I mean, also for the impact he's left. I mean, the way he's treated now, he's an incredibly famous philosopher, probably one of the most famous ones, besides the ancient Greeks and a few other names. And well, it's also interesting because although he's very famous, both I think academically and outside, in academia he's always very frequently referenced. But in both cases, I think there's very few people who actually go in depth in Nietzsche ideas. He's always brought up in the conversation, and he's always sort of acknowledged as an important person, but rarely is he ever the central focus. So I think it's important to dig in deep. And I mean, the main thing he's known for is for being very radical. He represents a break from the dominant Western tradition in lots of ways. In the 18th century, obviously, the main thing is, I think, the Enlightenment, right? There's a general post-Kantian, with the Enlightenment, a focus on reason, and what Nietzsche calls the death of God, which is probably his most famous saying. What he's referring to there is the loss in belief in God in society, which he sort of saw a lot sooner than a lot of other people. And the main thing that preoccupied him was, how are we going to replace this loss of God? And the Enlightenment project generally sees reason as filling in the role that God used to play. Reason can ground morality, sort of, as long as we continue and focusing on reason and empirical evidence, sort of, we will figure out the best way to live. And this was what religion previously did. Nietzsche pushes back against this very heavily, and he sees the reason as just being incapable of fulfilling that role in principle. And that's a very big statement, especially for a philosophy student like I was. I mean, the reason one gets into philosophy a lot is based on this kind of idea, maybe subconsciously, that if we think hard enough and just do philosophy and study, eventually we'll be able to figure out what to do with our lives. That's generally the trend in most of Western philosophy, the project you'd say that most of philosophers are trying to do. And for me, reading Nietzsche was a sort of very big personal shock of like, wow. It sort of exposes, first of all, what I didn't even know that I thought of things in that way, and it gave me a whole new perspective on how one might approach philosophy.
So, one of the things I think that can be helpful to do, and I think really fits with this theme, is putting a character to the ideas. So, could you just talk about like Nietzsche's life, like literally his life, the things that he went through, and how that shaped this idea that you're talking about now.
So I'd say the main thing that characterizes Nietzsche in his life is he had a life of extreme suffering. It's almost impossible to separate his life from this, for his philosophy from this, in fact. And he doesn't try to, unlike the way he criticizes other thinkers who is, they try to abstract their philosophy from themselves to reach an objective truth. Nietzsche wholeheartedly accepts that, no, my philosophy is a reflection of who I am. And it's almost a source of pride for this. And so, yeah, Nietzsche's was born in a religious family but lost his faith after a while. His father, who was a pastor, died at a very young age. And throughout his whole life, he was sick, very sick. He had bouts of migraines, which would last like weeks on end, with temporary blindness and vomiting all the time. He was incapable of doing anything. And sort of, I think the loss of faith definitely impacted him a lot because obviously there was no meaning to all this suffering. He's struggling to find any meaning in this. And sort of the secular moralities that took the place of Christianity, for instance, like utilitarianism, under a strict utilitarian calculus, we would judge that Nietzsche's life was terrible because it had far more suffering than it did pleasure. But Nietzsche wants to reject that, obviously. He sees like, who are you to tell me that my life isn't worth living? His philosophical project is essentially finding a reason to affirm life in and of itself. He wants to make all the suffering worth it, in a sense. And that's why Nietzsche is, you connect to his philosophy on a much more personal level. Nietzsche is more of like a friend, almost, he says. When you're reading Nietzsche's work, I always feel you feel a personal connection to him, because the project that he's embarking on is one that's, deeply personal and relatable. And I think it's worth reading his books with always that in mind.
So it's something like Nietzsche had a life of immense suffering, immense pain, and he's looking at all these other philosophers who are saying, well, there's something better outside of that pain, outside of that suffering that can justify your life. And he's sitting there going, my life has been nothing but suffering, and I'm not looking to justify my life or appreciate life by changing that suffering. I'm looking at my life and trying to appreciate in tandem with the suffering.
Yes.
Well, I mean, this idea of affirming life, how do we practice that on a tangible everyday basis? What is his mechanism
Right.
that he says that the diagnosis or prognosis for how we should affirm life, even if like we're suffering from syphilis, I'm just throwing shit out there like syphilis, back pain, health concerns, tragedies, etc.
Yeah. Well, as I was saying, yes, there's there's no straight path, and this is one of the difficulties and maybe frustrations in reading Nietzsche, because we want sort of someone to tell us what to do when we see this, when we see sort of the state that Nietzsche, the way things Nietzsche lays out, the way Nietzsche lays out things, where our immediate concern is to go like, well, how is this possible? How is this possible? And the answer is that there's no way you can come to this just by reading an outside source. It always has to come from within. As he says, sort of the philosophy you adopt is always going to be a reflection of your character. So thinking about it isn't going to solve this. I'd say obviously there are some tangible sort of things that he does, but these are more sort of broad guidelines. I think one of the main ones is the valuation of reason, right? Because of the Enlightenment, reason has always held the primary role, the primacy of reason. But this actually goes far back, way before the Enlightenment. I mean, Nietzsche reads all of Western philosophy as a history of constantly trying to fight away the fear of uncertainty, because this is what he sees as the ground of philosophizing, of wanting to find the truth. It's a fear of uncertainty, essentially. A fear of uncertainty and a need to have control, basically. So you feel like your life is in order and everything is fine, in a sense. So, in the Socratic tradition, there is always a primacy of reason, what Nietzsche calls like the tyranny of reason over all else. And the primacy of reason causes you to doubt your own instincts, right? Because your instincts aren't rationally justifiable. They're just things that pre-exist you. And the reason why this is a bit unsustainable is because the drive to place reason as the highest, the most important factor in your life, sort of to give it all this normative value, is based on an instinct. It's based on this instinct to avoid uncertainty and try to grasp this ultimate truth that you think will ground yourself and make you feel more secure, right? Um, so when reason is sort of employed as a weapon against the instincts, it is attacking itself in a sense, right? And this is what causes the death of God for Nietzsche ultimately, actually. Because Christianity is what he calls an extension of Platonism, right? It's following from the Socratic tradition. It's Platonism for the masses, he says. But regardless, the instinct for truth, to reach the ultimate truth, which in Platonism is the forms, in Christianity it's God, heaven. It turns on itself because the need for truth sort of like turns on the own instinct for truth and reveals that to be empty itself. And so you're left with the situation we are in now, where sort of everything is devalued. So Nietzsche essentially, to get to the point of how to practically sort of, one practical thing you can put on is to trust your instincts again, basically. To understand that there's no sense in doubting instincts beyond a certain point. We're used to this extreme rationalism by which the only time that you can value something is when it is rationally justified to value so. But for Nietzsche, there isn't any more. The source of normative value is itself your instincts. We have this notion of wanting to abstract ourselves from our own instincts, our own desires, our own inclinations, and view them from a third person perspective. But that
I
perspective doesn't exist.
I love examples. I'm a big example person. So can you give me some examples that uh besides Nietzsche himself that he thinks abides by this principle or holds up this principle if he mentions any, or just give me some hypothetical scenarios where this is actualized, because it's very theoretical right now and I want to put it into the practical world.
Okay, as in thinking about practical ways in which reason has its limitations. I mean,
Yes.
this is a very common practice in most sort of therapeutic situations. A lot of anxiety is caused by this very false notion that I must think of a way to get out of this problem. I feel sort of like uncertainty and I don't know what to choose, and I just keep on thinking, and I can't stop thinking. I think this fundamentally is based on a mistrust of instincts. The instinctual person doesn't need to think so much, because he sort of has an intuition about it. He intuitively knows what sort of situation reacts well with the kind of person he is and whatnot.
The idea is something like there's this problem and there's this way that I'm feeling. I must just be able to solve it by reasoning my way to the solution. And in most cases, I think people would understand that that's not the case. There's a lot of situations where you're in where you can't reason. Reason doesn't get you to the the resolution.
Yeah. I think it's important here to know that a lot of people, as soon as they hear these things from Nietzsche, they immediately think that he's anti-reason. I've heard this. It's the same sort of critique you get for the postmodernist types, and Nietzsche is actually a pre-postmodernist. A lot of people give him sort of credit for his influence on existentialism, which is true. He's one of the first existentialists, you might say, but he's also one of the first postmodernists because of his rejection of truth and his perspectivism and these kinds of things. But again, none of these people are against reason. Acknowledging the limitations of reason is not being against reason. It's setting its right place. Otherwise, even Kant, for instance, would be against reason, which is kind of ridiculous.
I mean, this idea of uh, realizing or embracing that reason isn't sufficient or doesn't go far enough to account for most instances. Do you think in society right now that we've embraced this idea? I mean, I know it's not a specific to Nietzsche idea, but it's one that's heavily associated with him. Are we practicing that now in society, or do you think we still have much more to go?
Yeah, no, I don't think we're very close to what Nietzsche would envision, at least, or what would be a healthy amount. There's still, I think, a lot of you know, um, mistrust of the instincts and placing reason on top of everything else. I mean, despite a lot of sort of philosophical and academic work, as I mentioned, postmodernism, for instance, and a lot of insights in psychology, I think, which acknowledge this. The limitations of reason. I think as a society, we're still like quite far from embracing it. I think the biggest change now would probably be in terms of science, because I mean that was obviously a big factor for the Enlightenment as well, but that drive has only hypertrophied in time now. So we look to science for the answer to a lot of questions which science can't really give. Science is very good at what it does, but what it does is make predictions for the future and use that to build technology and help our lives. And it's very good at doing that. But I think there is still an idea that science is somehow going to give us values, tell us how we should live our lives, and that is something that's simply out of the domain of science, and which is what science can't do. And I also think, given the death of God, science has obviously tried to fill in this void, right, as the giver of normativity, the thing that tells us what we should be doing with our lives. And I think technology and AI as sort of a culmination, sort of the highest point of this technology, is an even more strong instinct in this direction. I think there is a sort of idea in what we're doing with AI and technology broadly that we can outsource our search for how we should live our lives. Once technology and AI become more advanced enough, we can sort of just like give these questions to the AI, and the AI will solve it for us. But obviously, that isn't going to work, because again, morality, how you should live your life, is a inherently, inescapably personal sort of question, and no external factor can really tell you how you should live your life.
I do want to touch on this AI question, because I do think that is one thing that a lot of people are feeling is like we're getting to the point where we're essentially saying we don't need humans because AI and these high techs can do reason better than humans can. And you're saying that Nietzsche's response to that would be, yes, AI can do certain things and reason well much better than humans can, but we can't eliminate the human element to it because there is limitations to these to what reason can get us to. And that's one of the main reasons why, like you said, high tech, AI, all of these high powered machines are never going to be able to uh, replace like human tasks, human things. And I guess if you do think that AI can replace most of human tasks and most of human experience, then you probably are thinking that to reach the highest truths, or to kind of that the highest amount of reason, or the highest order of reason, is sufficient to accomplish, like, or to fulfill life.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's related again to what my paper is about, which is like salvation and soteriology. This thing was the doctrine of salvation, which is the target of Nietzsche's criticism in Christianity. But I think with the death of God, sort of there are a lot of secular versions of this salvation. The sort of the drive for salvation hasn't been abolished. A lot of atheists would like to think they have. As soon as they stop believing in God, they think they're rid of sort of the religious impulse, and the any kind of religious connotations, but of course they're not, and they just move this drive to be saved away from God and into something else. And I think AI is certainly one of those sort of like it's less of a personal one, I'd say, because I don't think you'll get many people who I mean, will say consciously, first of all, that they think AI will, you know, usher in a utopia. But even on a personal level, I don't think they're banking a lot on AI doing this. I think the personal sort of like means of salvation following the death of God would be more something like, I don't know, romantic love, I'd say, or fame. I think is a big one in nowadays society, and money, I suppose. But AI would be more of, I think, a collective project, collective salvation project, and hope that we've put ourselves into.
Now that's a really fascinating idea, and I think one that's starting to get talked about more, but still definitely not enough, is this idea that salvation outside of a religious connotation, that there can be like that we're at the point now where maybe people are going away from the religious salvation, but there's a different kind of salvation that people are embracing.
I think the most prominent individual responses, love, fame, and money. There's an obsession with all three of them, which goes far beyond the point of just like wanting it for our own personal pleasure. Um, I think you know, love is maybe the most striking one. That I think we get this myth that there is something wrong with me right now. There is something wrong with, you know, existence in general, with my life, and the thing that is wrong with it is that I haven't found the right person yet. And as soon as I find the right person, everything will be fine. We'll be in love, and it'll just go on forever. But of course, real love is hard work. It's not something easy, and it won't alleviate that sense of something being wrong with you.
So as I take it just from what you said, Nietzsche's critique is not so much is not limited to this kind of religious salvation. It's the thinking that there is this type of there is a higher world that can save you. It is thinking in terms of there's something out there that can save me.
Yes.
That's the critique.
So, the Hinterwelt is Nietzsche's term for the behind world. That's what it literally means. It's German for behind world. And Nietzsche has a great chapter in Twilight of the Idols, my favorite book, where he details the history of Western philosophy according to the idea of this Hinterwelt, this behind world. So since Plato, he thinks philosophy has been an attempt to sort of reach this behind world, to escape from this current world and find meaning and fulfillment in the behind world. And the first example of this is obviously with Plato, with Plato's forms. And for Plato, the forms are reachable, you know, in the famous allegory of the cave. If you become a philosopher and act morally, you can reach the good and sort of partake in the true reality. You know, the true reality is available to the sage and the wise man. Then in Christianity, the true world is not accepted. Not you can't reach it right now, but it's promised to you later. To the sage, again, to the sinner who repents. All these philosophical systems and all these hinterwells are never the here and the now. They're always something that's hidden and that we've got to. It's our task to realize, right? Yeah, so it's sort of a combination of those two. And Nietzsche will interject here, as I was saying, by instead of trying to to come up with a new goal, right? The goal of Nietzsche's work is to get rid of this teleology, get rid of a desire for another world, get rid of the desire to be saved. It's an anti-soteriology, right? And this is where the parallels with Zen come in.
So I do want to get to the Zen Buddhism. You talk about in your paper that I mentioned at the top of the show this idea of eternal recurrence and how that very much plays a role in I believe how that plays a role in Nietzsche's idea of how we should avoid or turn away from the soteriological perspective. But before we talk about that, the critique of this from the Buddhist perspective, Zen Buddhist perspective, can you just tell me a little bit about, like, explain what that concept is and how it relates into what we were just talking about Nietzsche's philosophy?
Yeah, so the eternal recurrence is a very important part of his philosophy. I mean, he says himself that it's sort of the crown of his own philosophy. But considering that it's very vague and unclear when he does bring it up, it's only brought up maybe in like 3 times in his entirety of his texts, and so there's a lot of different interpretations as to what exactly he's trying to say when he's doing that, and when he's saying this. But in my view, it's supposed to be the ultimate affirmation of life, of the attitude of amor fati, sort of in practice. So the eternal recurrence is like a thought experiment, which he posits in The Gay Science, where he says, imagine if a demon sort of comes to you in the middle of the night, in your loneliest of lonelies, and he tells you that your life as you have lived it, you have already lived it infinite times in the past, and you will live it infinite times in the future in exactly the same way. And there's nothing else but your life forever. You know, every single sigh and every single bit of suffering and dissatisfaction will be repeated forever. And the point of the eternal recurrence is to tease out what your attitude towards life is. You know, Nietzsche reckons that most people, when faced with this demon, would not be happy at this result. They would sort of think, "Oh no, my life is meaningless because that's all there is. I'll have to do this forever, you know, and it doesn't lead anywhere. There's no point to it, and la di da." But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You know, there's no logical reason. Again, when we point to the limits of rationality, this sort of conclusion isn't something you reach logically. It's just an expression of your character, a reflection of your character. And so the person who responds in this way, all he is sort of showing is his lack of love for life. The Übermensch, which is another one of Nietzsche's very famous concepts, very vague and often misinterpreted. But the Übermensch, I've always read him as the person who can say yes to the eternal recurrence, who wouldn't just be okay with the eternal recurrence happening, but he would be happy. The demon would be a god to him, an angel. He would thank the demon for telling him this news, because he's sort of like, wow, my life forever? There's no greater news than this. And the Übermensch is someone who's not only capable of saying it in that moment, but he's somebody who would choose to recur to who choose the eternal recurrence in any moment of his life. You know, just imagine the worst tragedy that's happened to him. His entire family has just died, you know. Still, he would choose to recur life infinitely because he just loves it so much. I guess the attitude Nietzsche wants us to embrace, I think, is always like a child who sort of goes on a roller coaster and just gets off the roller coaster and it's just like, immediately another one, another one, another one. I must go again. You know, I love that so much. Yeah, that's the kind of attitude Nietzsche wants us to adopt towards life. And it's very, very hard, obviously, given our circumstances, to be someone who can at all times be willfully able to recur our life infinitely. But that is why I think Nietzsche would put it as the Übermensch, the beyond human. It's a task for, not for us, but for somebody who surpasses us right now, I suppose.
Your paper explores both Nietzsche's perspective and the Zen Buddhist perspective. Can you talk to me just about why you think that the Zen Buddhist perspective fits with Nietzsche's philosophy?
Yeah, so Buddhism has gone through sort of 2,000 years of development since Nietzsche understood it. And Zen, Mahayana Buddhism, and particularly Zen, I think, push back against the narrative of Theravada in a very similar way that Nietzsche does. The reason for this, with Zen in particular, is because this is when Buddhism migrated north into China and sort of fused with Taoism. So when Buddhism comes into contact with Taoism, they fuse and make Zen. And Zen pushes back heavily on all this rhetoric and almost to an irreverent degree, right? I mean, Linji, for instance, one of the Zen scholars, is famous for his phrase: "If you see the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha," you know. And it's meant to be a get rid of anything external from yourself that you think will get you enlightenment. You know, the idea that there is a path, that there is something to get. There is such a thing as samsara and nirvana, and some place you need to go in order to attain enlightenment. That is sort of what is keeping you from enlightenment in the first place. You know, the first shift is with Nagarjuna, who's like the most famous, most important Buddhist thinker outside of the Buddha himself. And his main contribution is shunyata, which is emptiness. And emptiness is sort of a radical reformation of dependent origination, which is one of the core Buddhist doctrines, which is that basically the interdependence of all objects and ideas and things. Everything is dependent on something else, and everything exists in this way, where there are no essences, there is no singular existence, and everything is dependent on itself. Emptiness takes this even further, where it says that not only are sort of things empty, but even philosophical doctrines are empty. They only make sense in relation to other things. They only make sense sort of in the context from which they arrive. So when you had the historical Buddha speaking to the people in 1500 BC and telling them about samsara and nirvana and how to attain enlightenment, this isn't some ultimate truth that's you sort of separated from everything else that we have to strive towards. Like, no, it's a way of doing expedient means, which is sort of a partial truth, a contextual truth, which is supposed to help someone attain realization. You know, for the people at that time that the Buddha was speaking to, he had to speak in words that they would understand in that context. And so he spoke of samsara and the liberation from samsara and meditation and whatnot. But these aren't ultimate truths. Ultimately, everything is empty. And even though that already sort of takes away a lot of the soteriological thinking, right, of getting rid of an ultimate truth, there's still, depending on the school of Mahayana, there's still some soteriology. Like, you know, the goal becomes, instead of attaining nirvana, you're understanding emptiness, and then sort of you attain nirvana. But Zen especially pushes back heavily against this, an important thing. And the notion of the no self is still prevalent in Zen, and but rather than being a sort of self-hating doctrine, as you know, the earlier one might be seen by someone like Nietzsche as a sort of will to destroy oneself to escape actuality. The no self is, I think, in Zen, a way for you to fully affirm existence. Right, the thing that's preventing you from affirming existence is the self itself, because the self, I think this is sort of the key insight of Buddhism, is that the self, when there is an ego self, it necessarily reaches for salvation. It necessarily wants to escape from its present position, because the self wants to be independent. It wants to have this standalone existence and be sort of the ground for its own being. But it can't do this because of dependent origination, the fact that everything is interlinked, including the self. And so it constantly strives to try and ground itself in something. And the way to affirm existence is to sort of forget the self. And so I would say the goals in both Nietzsche and Zen are very similar. It's an anti-soteriology in both. The goal of both is to try and get rid of the notion that there is something that you need to be saved from. The notion of there being a goal or a purpose to reality and existence.
Wow. That was certainly a lot. I wrote down here that the self reaches for salvation, and so the only way to affirm existence is to get rid of the self.
Mm-hmm.
But Nietzsche would say, actually, affirm it, like the difference, as I understand it, is the path to this anti-soteriology or anti-salvation for Zen Buddhism is to get rid of the self. For Nietzsche, it's to affirm the self.
I would say this is part of where the critique gets a bit shaky, because Nietzsche also doesn't believe in a fundamental self. The self for Nietzsche is still like a set of drives that are sort of competing. There's no core to the self, and the sort of dualities that we always impose onto the world, such as subject and object, are more like products of language, sort of simplifications for evolution that sort of helps us survive, useful tools. Yeah, so Nietzsche as well has a notion of the self. But I do think that fundamentally what you're saying is correct in practice. I think in practice, Nietzsche doesn't quite embody the forgetting of the self. Uh, the fact, I think, that Nietzsche's work, Nietzsche's thought contains within it a lot of tension still. This sort of existence is still something that's almost antagonistic for Nietzsche. Like there's a need to affirm it, sort of as a heroic struggle against nihilism that he sees himself embarking on. And yes, those notions are notions that like reinforce the self. And I think the where the eternal recurrence comes into this is that the eternal recurrence is fundamentally still a willing, a willing of amor fati, a willing of existence to repeat itself infinitely. Um, and the fact that there is a willing means that there's still sort of a self, obviously, to do the willing, and there's still sort of like some kind of antagonism, some sort of separation of the self from the world. As I was saying with joy, the eternal recurrence. If you look through this book Zarathustra, which is Nietzsche's main book on the eternal recurrence, the origin of the eternal recurrence lies in sort of like a deep joy, a love for life. You love it so much that you want it to recur infinitely, right? So this deep joy, however, I think for Zen, I think the joy would not be deep enough. Sort of Nietzsche is almost like a few steps away, maybe, because the deepest joy under a Zen perspective doesn't want to recur. It doesn't want anything because there is no self. It's fully satisfied with existence and needs nothing from it. Nietzsche's sort of like desire to make existence recur still sort of like betrays a subtle hint that he isn't perfectly content with reality as it is, because he sees the need for existence to recur infinitely. When you experience sort of the most profound joy for Zen, you don't experience anything. There is only the experience. There's a complete collapse of the separation between the self and reality. We can think of the eternal recurrence. This is a good analogy. It's sort of, when you're getting enraptured by music and sort of you start thinking, I wish this would last forever, or any positive experience. You start thinking, I wish this would last forever. And it's sort of that very thought is what sort of takes you out from the experience and separates it and sort of puts you back to reality in crude terms. The desire for the continuation of that experience is what causes the joy to be lessened, right? And yeah, if the joy is deep enough, obviously that desire wouldn't be there in the first place.
I have two questions. One is a point of clarification. So when you're talking about this idea of getting rid of the self from Zen Buddhism, is that just something like the way it sounds like is it's like you're just existing and you're content with that existence in the world around you, but you're not you're not seeing yourself as a like a definitive main character in this world. You're just living, and whatever happens to you happens, and you're content with that. Now, is that an oversimplification of the theory?
I mean, obviously, it's a simplification, but I'd say that's quite accurate in general. I think it's the lack of purpose that's important, right? You don't need anything from reality. When we talk about sort of forgetting the self and getting rid of the self, you don't actually mean getting rid of, like, really not having any sense of self at all. But it's more about realizing the inherent interconnectedness with everything, and not striving, as I was saying, not grasping onto things or needing things from reality. So it's a different way of viewing the self. Sort of the self as we view it now we sort of always think that there's something wrong with ourselves right now, and we always seek to get rid of it through whatever means possible. And this can go back to sort of the secular salvation we were talking about. I mean, you can do a very good, I think, Buddhist analysis of the way we seek to relieve our sense of lack from by using these secular salvations. We're sort of under a Buddhist hypothesis, we're always haunted by sort of this sense of lack, that there's something wrong with me right now. And the reason is because the self as I want it to be doesn't actually exist. The self isn't grounded. It isn't this like stable sort of metaphysical entity that's like separate from everything else. And well, forgetting the self is basically letting go of this need to ground yourself in anything, letting go of sort of the idea that I must do this in order to have value, otherwise I don't have value. It's an sort of infinite a realization of sort of the inherent valuelessness, but also value, the source of value.
Could you just try to just in very like simple terms say what it would be like for an ordinary person who is in the Nietzschean state to then transition to the Zen Buddhist state? Would their life change in any tangible sense, or is it entirely in the psychological state that the different distinction between the two is? Like how? Because again, this idea of forgetting, of letting go of the self, in principle, that's concept that I can grasp and understand and theoretically it makes sense, but it strikes me as something where it's like it's impossible for people to grasp until they have achieved it, and maybe even then they don't know exactly what it is. They just know that they are in it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Zen perspective is particularly strange, I'd say, but also more simple in a sense, where there isn't actually something you need to realize. There isn't actually a special state in which you have to reach. Despite what I've been saying, if you think you're enlightened, then you're not enlightened, because you you clearly haven't got it. You sort of have these. You've taken these ideas of what you think enlightenment means from somewhere else and sort of like imposed them on yourself and done this kind of thing. But in comparison to Nietzsche, I'd say like even more charitably would say that sort of the Zen no self state is what Nietzsche was aiming for in his life, but didn't quite get. And I'd say that might be going a bit far, but I think it's possible. In terms of the difference between the two, I'd say again, Nietzsche perpetuates this struggle against existence. It's sort of like a triumph that needs to be had, which maintains this teleological attitude, I do think, of like, life is something that needs to be affirmed, and we're going to get to that point later on. You're delaying this. And Zen, I think, would be the full realization of this. Nietzsche has a very good quote that I like, where he says, mature manhood is regaining the seriousness one had as a child at play, And I think that embodies the Zen ideal. The playfulness often comes in a lot with all the masters, because there's no point to what they're doing. There's no ultimate purpose. They're just doing it as a reflection of existence in a sense. But it doesn't mean that they're sort of unserious about things or they don't care about anything. Because if you look at children in play, they're very serious when they play. They're very involved in it, right? But they don't sort of actually care about it in an existential sense.
Turning more to, well, shifting gears a little bit, I do I know you are interested in this philosopher too. I know he ties into Nietzsche. He ties in a little bit to Buddhism too, and I think it's worth bringing it up, particularly around this time of the year. And that's Kierkegaard. And I mentioned to him a little bit in the beginning that I thought some of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity didn't, of being an extension of the Platonic tradition, didn't hold up necessarily to Kierkegaard's conception of Christianity. Now, for those of you who don't know, Soren Kierkegaard, he's a Danish philosopher. Nietzsche is German. That's not really relevant, but he grew up in a very religious background. He, like Nietzsche, suffered a ton in his life. He had many, many ailments. So many people close to him died when he was at a young age. He lost so many family members. He himself ended up dying at 34. Or maybe it was 36, but there was something where he thought his entire life that he was going to die at the same age Jesus died. And he got like really, really close. But had a life of immense suffering, was crippled, I think, a little bit, although I'm not 100% sure about that fact. So yes, immense of a life of immense suffering, who was also grouped into the existentialist category. And
Proto-existentialist, I'd say, right? But yes.
yeah, well, Christian existentialist.
Yeah, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are sort of like the forerunners to existentialism generally.
Right. And he like Nietzsche has this critique of reason, in the sense that he thinks that reason or our rational capabilities are not capable of accounting for all of our moral understanding. He thinks that there is a level above reason that reason can't account for, that is just as important, if not more important, than reason in terms of moral thinking. So he's very much on board with Nietzsche in that criticism. But where Nietzsche critiques people who see the current world as worse and bad, and then this higher world as being separate, and the goal is to leave the current world and get to the higher world, where he sees that as bad, Kierkegaard is much more focused on bringing those two worlds together.
Yes, I'd say that's a very, very key element to it. I think, well, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are preoccupied with very similar things. They are actually very similar thinkers who lived at around the same time as well. And well, my current research project, my thesis, is going to be about a comparison with these two, and then eventually I want to get Zen Buddhism in there somewhere. But yeah, I think both of them have the subjectivist turn, right, where they see values as being inherently subjective, something that you have to come up with your own personal connection. The important differences with Kierkegaard is that sort of it's in personal connection with God, right, which sort of gives them a sense of of objective authority. But in the end, it's not really morality as we understand it normally is something that can and will be transcended when God demands it, right? This is what he gets in Fear and Trembling. I don't know how much we want to get into that, to be fair. But I think Kierkegaard is, the interesting thing about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche comparison is that Kierkegaard is very much like an anomaly in Nietzsche's sort of like framework for a typology of the Christian, right? Kierkegaard would pretty much agree, I think, with most of Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity. Because Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity are not really against Christ, the figure, or anything. It's much more to do with sort of the social impact of Christianity. And Kierkegaard's whole career, despite being a Christian, was criticizing the Danish church and the institution at his time, and saying that nobody was really a Christian at his time. Nobody actually embodied the Christian faith, because the institution of Christianity at the time was sort of just like a crutch for people to stand on. It wasn't anything. I think Kierkegaard has a great quote where he says, in a world which everybody is trying to make things easier, I want to make one thing harder, and that's faith. Faith for Kierkegaard doesn't provide comfort. Faith isn't this sort of like beyond world that one looks to when one is dissatisfied with the current world in order to relieve oneself of dissatisfaction. No, it's sort of it's a source of strength. It's a call to personally engage with the world in a way that you take the transcendent and make it immanent. And to not use technical terminology, the transcendent would be the hint to what we were talking about, this other world that is sort of like superior and separate from this world. And Kierkegaard sort of, with his intrinsically personal relationship with God, sees the task of affirming life as one of, instead of, as in Nietzsche, getting rid of the other world entirely, it would be one of bringing the other world down to the here and the now, right? To have God, realize God's transfiguring presence in your everyday life and in the world around you at all times.
Right. That is the thing that Kierkegaard heavily critiques, right? He thinks there is the idea that you can rationalize on your own to make your life better, to get to something, a point of no suffering, a point of better existence. That is actually like despair. That is how you stay in the state of despair. If you're not willing to give up the idea that you on your own can reach like a better state, a more like if that you can improve your suffering, then you're destined for despair.
Yeah, well, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard's idea of the self is also very interesting. I mean, there's the one definition of the self that's always sort of a bit of a meme. It's parodied because it's what, like, the self is a relation to the self that relates itself in self. Yeah, I encourage anyone to look it up. It's very funny. It's complicated to the point that some people think that he's parodying Hegel while writing that. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that because it does make sense when you sort of get into the weeds of it. But the
I
main
actually
thing,
did.
yeah,
I was gonna say I actually I don't know if you remember this, but I did a whole my thesis last year was on this idea, and I used the idea of a souffle to explain this concept and how I took that whole definition of the self and the relation to the self as it's relating to whatever it is. And yes, it's very complex, and I probably am like, again, when you're deep into it, you think you understand it, and then when you take a step out, you realize you really don't understand it.
yes, of course, I remember reading your thesis. I could never forget. Um, yeah, but so the important thing I think to take out of there is that the self for Kierkegaard is not something stable. It's not something sort of atomistic that's separate from the rest of the world and from God. It's a relation, right? It's always constantly relating to itself.
Well, I guess for Kierkegaard, the critique is holding on to the idea that you can actually improve this relation on your own, that you yourself can. I think I said this before, and it's very abstract, but that you can reach that higher state on your own, that you can actually take steps to alleviate the suffering that you have on your own. So for Kierkegaard, the only way to completely get rid of that suffering is actually to give up the idea that you can improve your situation, improve yourself, but paradoxically, while still believing that as you're giving up that self, you're becoming, as we said, the self in the higher order, the
self relating to
or
God.
yes, the self relating to God, the more ideal or perfect self.
Yes, this is where actually the comparison with Zen Buddhism comes. I think it's quite similar to the concept of forgetting the self in Zen Buddhism. There's a really great quote by the Zen master Huang Po, which is actually, as soon as I read it, I remember I immediately thought of Kierkegaard. And he says, men are afraid to fall into the void because they think that the void is the realm of nothingness, something like this. Men are afraid to fall into the void, or to forget this. Sorry. All right. Edit this out. Men are afraid to forget their minds, fearing to fall through the void, but they do not know that the void is not really the void, but the realm of the Buddha Dharma. Basically, what he's saying is that we often think of forgetting the self as leading to some kind of nihilism. You let go of your values, of what you care about, and that's going to sort of end you in a sense. But in the Kierkegaardian framework, the step of abandoning yourself, your own like personal desires, is sort of the necessary step that you need to take in order for yourself to become a vessel, in a sense, for you to be united with God, with the rest of the universe, in a sense, in sort of the correct way in which you can actually realize those values. So forgetting the self in Kierkegaard is where you
Right.
let go of sort of your own personal desires, of the way things you want to turn out, and you lay trust in God and hope that sort of you are absorbed into the will of God. And basically the idea is that through your personal relationship with God, you know God so intimately that, and you trust God so much that you will get everything you want through it anyway. There's a trust in God that could be mirrored in the Zen sense when you have this sort of like trust in the universe. You let go of trying to grasp onto something that you think will be your salvation, and sort of you let the self be ungrounded, and that ungrounded self is like what you realize that you wanted all along from the grasping.
I mean, there seems to be this like fundamental unifying idea behind a lot of these people, but I would say even more like, and this I might get some heat from this from some people in the comments, if there is people in the comments, but I think even like there's a lot of similarities with actually the teachings in the gospel, and like what kind of Jesus' whole message is like, forget, you need to let go of this idea that you on your own are going to somehow better your life and make it more valuable, more worthy, more important by doing these certain things, by
Yeah.
we just talked about love, fame, money, but he would even say like the even like he would even
Even
extend that
morality,
to
right? Yes, even
even
morality as we
morality,
understand it as a social thing. Yes.
but even to the religious people at the time who were like, oh, by doing these certain religious practices,
Yeah.
these religious traditions, to get me closer to God, I am going to somehow like become a more important person. And he
Yes.
wants to shove that all under the rug and say, no, none of you are more important than the other. None of yourselves are more important
Yes.
than the other. The highest importance that you guys have, your entire worth, is in relation to God. And that is Kierkegaard's idea too. It's your entire worth is yourself grounded in God. Yourself grounded in something other than that is completely worthless. And you thinking that
Yes.
it is going to lead you to a life of constant despair, even if you don't know that it is.
Absolutely. That was actually brilliantly put. I totally agree with this. And Zen Buddhism has a very similar thing where attempting to ground yourself in anything is mistaken, and is what leads to suffering and dissatisfaction and whatnot. The point of disagreement, I guess, is obviously Kierkegaard says that you can ground yourself in God, whereas the Buddhists say that there is no ground. Everything is ultimately groundless, and once you realize that everything is groundless, sort of you let go of the need for grounding in the first place. But there is a sense in which sort of as we were saying in the Kierkegaardian self, right? The self is something that is trying to be actualized. It's in the process of becoming something, right? And it's trying to actualize itself, and it's trying to do it through all these different things we were saying. And it's the same thing in Buddhism, right? The self tries to realize itself, to make itself real, because it's haunted by the fact that it isn't real in the first place. And in Zen, letting go of this need to be real, you find yourself realized by sort of the totality of existence in of itself. There's no need to be realized as separate from existence, which is what we're constantly trying to do. But existence as a whole basically realizes you as this sort of like formless no thing. It's not a thing, as in it's not like an existent one thing, but it's also not nothing. There's this no thing which realizes you as such. So in that sense, it's not too different. And I mean, since we're doing comparative religion and comparative spirituality, I'm always reminded of the Einstein quote as well, I think, where he puts it very well. He says that the goal of true religion, of any true spirituality, is basically to let go of this delusion of consciousness that you are a self separate from everything else. All other spirituality that doesn't aim for this and aims for like sort of specific things that it wants is not true spirituality. And I mean, I think in this sense you can even branch Nietzsche in that thinker. As I was saying, he's a very spiritual thinker himself. But yeah, I don't want to obviously get too close to perennialism, and sort of try and ignore the differences in religion by making them all out to be the same ones. But I do think that the religious drive is obviously a fundamental human drive that manifests itself in very different ways. And sure, I would agree that the goal of true spirituality is to realize your ultimate interconnectedness with the universe, whether that be through God or through the no thing or Brahman or whatever other religions go by.